Welcome to tonight's lecture by Kunle Adeyemi entitled 7 Decimer Factors. How many know what decimer means? How many looked up what decimer means? You came to a lecture, you don't even know what it's about. I looked up decimer online for definition online. And the closest you can get is a French translation of décimètre, but which doesn't mean anything in French. So I went to Google Books, because sometimes you can find a word in Google Books, and I got lots. Oh no, sorry. The first hit I got. I looked at this. The first hit I got was Kunle's website. So now that should be yeah. Then I said definition, and I got the French translation. So I went to Google Books and I got lots of hits. Okay, I thought finally. But it turns out decimer, it was a miscalc, a mistranslation, a misscan of designer. So I thought the communications department made a mistake that somehow decimer was supposed to be 7 designer factors. I'm probably the only person in the building that has Webster's Third International, which is an analog dictionary about this thick. It's not in there. Kunle has confessed for an obsession with water. He has architectural designs. Some of them were going through there, produced like the celebrated Makoko floating school. It's a prototype for a school facility built on the water in Lagos. And then the kind of 2.0 version was exhibited in the Venice Biennale last year. This structure that floats on a barge out in the Grand Canal and the lagoon of Venice. So decimer may have something to do with absolutely magical moments when architecture floats. You'll see this. I decided it had that IMER was a kind of floating thing. But Kunle's obsession with water also led him to produce projects in cities across the global south that are simultaneously facing prospects of rapid urbanization and climate change, but also sometimes needing water, sometimes having too much water, all kinds of different ways of water can become a problem that is urgently infrastructural. So I decided decimer must also mean something like urgently infrastructural. And I think I'm onto something. Not only is he smiling, but he designed a Z-Line student desk, which he described as infrastructure. So I think magical and infrastructure may be it. Kunle grew up in Nigeria and studied at the University of Lagos before he went to Princeton University, and then just after that formed his studio, his office in Unle, N-L-E. If you can pronounce Kunle, you can pronounce Unle, right? In 2014, he was the Baird Distinguishing Visiting Critic of Cornell, and in 2011, the Callison Distinguished Lecturer at the University of Washington. In addition, I mentioned the Venice Biennale, but he's exhibited also, he designed one of the structures for the Serpentine Summer House at the Serpentine Galleries. As I said, his work and teaching and research takes us to the global south. His firm is in Amsterdam, I may not have said that, and also Lagos, but his work has included work across the Americas, Europe, Africa, the Middle East, East Asia, but his research, I said, was largely in the global south, and that's the studio he's doing for us here is in Africa. He's the work also includes projects that he did while he was lead architect, project architect at OMA, and these include the Samsung Museum. You know the Prada transformer in South Korea, the Shenzhen Stock Exchange in China, the Qatar National Library and foundational headquarters. Those are just naming a few of the projects that he worked on before UNLE in OMA. All you have to do is speak to Kunle on the phone to realize the enormously generous spirit he has. And the work shows that, where he's worked shows that. In 2010, I'm just going to let him write his own introduction here and end with this. Whether a chair for a charity in South Africa, a revolutionary rotating art space for Prada in Seoul, or the visionary plan to eliminate traffic paralysis in Lagos. In each project, the essential needs of performance, value, and identity are fundamentally the same for me. Although quantitatively different from place to place, the responsibility of achieving these needs at maximum with minimum means remains the same globally. I am constantly inspired by solutions we discover in everyday life in the world's developing cities. And I very much look forward to seeing the results of some of that research. Kunle, welcome.
Thank you so much, Michael. That's a very beautiful introduction. I'm very flattered, actually. I'm very flattered because you spent so much time trying to figure out what Decima meant. Well, Decima is essentially a tool or a design tool that we developed about 5 years ago to analyze urban dynamics in a way that is not primarily focused on design, but to enable us understand the complex issues that surround architecture, urbanism, and it's an acronym essentially. So I'm sure you may have been diverted to Decima with a C in your search, and it's not an error. So it's an acronym for demographics, economics, social politics, infrastructure, morphology, environment, and resources. Today I'm going to expand what this tool or what this methodology with one project, how we have kind of used it in this sort of world universe of one project that has several scales of application that we have been working on for the last 6 years. But before I go on, a very quick introduction of UNLE, which Michael said very clearly it's my practice, which is really focused on developing cities and communities, and I really believe that architecture, urbanism, and design are tools for understanding these contexts, and regardless of the fact that you might be running a business practice, it's an important thing that we have a social and environmental consciousness. And UNLE means at home. That's really because we believe the home is a fundamental building block of every society. And today, the home has become the city and community, or cities and communities have become homes. So at UNLE, what we operate from 4 different fields: architecture, urbanism, research, arts and culture, and we have done several projects across in different parts of the world, and some of these include my experience at OMA, which have really had an impact on the diverse ways I see development. So some of the projects I had the fortune to work on include these ones that Michael also mentioned earlier, and some of these are the projects that we're working on today. But I think for today's lecture, I want to focus on one of the issues that really drive our office, and those are influenced by some of the most pressing challenges of our time, the challenges of inequality, sustainable development, climate change, diversity, energy, etc. And how architecture and what the role of architecture and the practice of architecture, how we actually plays in all of this complex issues. So in trying to understand that, I think our first lens of investigation is really on sustainable development. And there are lots of definitions around what sustainable development means, but for us, this definition by the World Commission on Environment and Development is really the key thing, which defines sustainability as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising those of the future generations. And I think if you think about that, if you stop to really think about what that means, it's really about responsibility. And so 7 decimal factors is really a tool to unpack the complex urban dynamics of sustainable development across 7 disciplines or 7 issues that really affect development, architecture, and urbanism. So typically one would imagine that as an architect that design is the main focus, but we believe that design is only a tool to orchestrate these issues, and only by understanding these issues would you have a much broader idea of how to tackle them, particularly in a world where the challenges of our time are beyond sort of the physical manifestations that we're used to, let's say the sort of formal education teaches us. So demographics, economics, sociopolitics, infrastructure, morphology, environment, and resources. I mentioned some of the challenges of our time, and I would say 2 of the most important that we tackle at Nle, one, urbanization, and the other is climate change. Now, I'll talk about urbanization a bit with this image, which I always find very interesting, as Manhattan, a very important city, the sort of citadel of civilization and development, et cetera, and it's a sort of the archetype of modernity and all of that. At the same time, it's a place, this image shows why cities have become, as they say, man's greatest invention. It is a place of opportunity. There are places of development. There are places of it's where people sort of gravitate towards to find new forms of living, improved forms of living. We cannot talk about cities without talking about the rural areas, the countryside. So when I mention cities, I am not saying that in the absence of the understanding of the peripheral conditions. But for the simplicity of the conversation, urbanization and cities, it's a correlation between the context of convergence, which cities represent. So while cities are places are defined as man's greatest invention, I would also argue that they are potentially man's deadliest invention. And that's because of the challenges that we're beginning to see and that we have caused, or that we're part of, that humans have actually been part of the cause with the environment. And that is very evident with the issues of climate change. So you see in the same image of Manhattan, where half of it is shut down after Superstorm Sandy in 2012, which is in a way sort of a testimony to the fact that the environment, a counterpart to humanity, is also sort of fighting back in a way. So, so for me and for Nle, Decima is a way to understand the complex relationships between humanity and the environment. So it's about the tool to unpack the complex social and environmental conditions to enable us begin to think differently, to build differently, and hopefully to live differently. This is probably a cliche now, that nearly more than half of the world's population now live in cities, and that by 2050, nearly 7% of the world will live in cities. And what you see that is particularly interesting is that most of that convergence is happening in Asia and in African cities. This is a very basic fact that we've all sort of learned from high school, that over 70%, perhaps 71% exactly of the Earth is covered by water. So the territory that we're contesting for occupation is mostly around, is probably less than 10%, or after you take out the areas that are occupiable, I'm sure it's much less than 10%. So a large portion of the Earth is covered by water. And in 2011, we began research where we identified the major cities that are growing, that are urbanizing, and the cities that are large, that are of the largest economic development. So the world capital cities are all along water. So all of these cities that you see here are by water. It is no surprise because, of course, historically, the cradle of civilization is the Fertile Crescent is by water. Humans have always settled by water for obvious reasons of farming, transportation, and water is just simply the source of life. However, when you put it in context and you begin to realize that two forces are now coming into play, that we're converging towards these areas by water, and that there is also a threat to those areas due to the forces of climate change, then it means that these points are important points of focus. In 2011, again, we realized that of these cities, again, about 70% of the African capitals are also by water. And so for many that have not been to African cities, you might think it is all safari. And I'm sorry to disappoint you that you will not find most of that. And what you will see are important cities like those in Cape Town, Dakar, Dar es Salaam, Lagos, and they go on and on. At the same time, within the context of these kinds of cities are settlements, small settlements that are beginning to emerge, and they are sometimes they are peri-urban settlements, and sometimes they are actually rural settlements, and sometimes they are really in the heart of the city, but they are also evidence of a new, the birth of new cities by water. And so these are communities in Gambia, in South Sudan, in Ghana, in Senegal, that are all living by water. So in a way, these are, as you might imagine, sort of a DNA or the seeds for the development of new cities by water. So, as I mentioned, while Africa is what is the second most urbanizing continent in the world, it is actually it's probably the continent that is most affected by climate change, with a large area of it being within the high and extreme high risk zone, which means all of these dark areas are really at risk. So what you have is that there is, again, a convergence of urbanization and climate change happening in these places. So when you think about urbanization, when you think about climate change, most of the issues that we are kind of familiar with or that we hear is about CO2 emissions, and these are very technical, but this is an image of what is most impactful to everyday life in not only in African cities, but all over the world: flooding. This is an old picture, but I've probably shown it 100 times, and I would love to show it a lot more, because it really exemplifies or illustrates the issues that we're actually dealing with on the continent. That on one hand, you have people here struggling to get out of that condition, and right next to them, some people already trying to conquer it, believing that they have a submarine. But what's actually quite exciting for me is that we have actually found people that have submarines. They have invented their own form of tackling the problem, and they have actually they are already even having a great time. So, and ironically, you still see these people in the back there struggling to use their ways, their sort of technology. Now, this image is very important for my practice, because it is the evidence of the kind of lens that we use to understand the context that we're interested in a way that the point where the challenges of urbanization, climate change begin to sort of produce ingenuity, resourcefulness, resilience, and adaptation, where everyday people become more resourceful, and they begin to find their own solutions. And we are trying to learn from that environment to understand what people are already doing, and not necessarily invent new things, but really see what people are doing and try to develop it forward. Now, the continent, Africa, has gone through lots of changes in the last 10, 20 years. And this, so again, is a snapshot of that kind of extreme condition, where in May of 2000, The Economist cover shows Africa as a hopeless continent, and just about 10 years later, it is the same cover of Africa Rising. So that led us to begin to question why the continent is changing so quickly, and particularly this is even a more recent condition, where as the continent, as Europe is tending to sort of split, and we're getting all kinds of political complexities. I would just for lack of a better term, across the world, the African Union is converging. So there's sort of a shift towards unity on the continent. So we began, I'll just quickly, I'll jump through this. Okay, sorry. So we wanted to find out why this was, why there were so many changes going on the continent, where these changes were happening, what were the forms of developments that were taking place, and who were the key players actually driving these changes on the continent. And in about 5 years ago, we began this analysis, looking at all the cities, looking at population density, projection, growth rates, and identifying the ones by water and the ones inland, and looking at the ones that are threatened by sort of overlapping the information of climate change and risk, and identified what we call the top 20 African water cities, and launched a project called the African Water Cities Project in 2011, where the the sizes sort of indicates the cities with the population, higher population. So we've researched four of these with different institutions, and we're now on the fifth one with the GSD now, and with a great team of students here at Harvard, looking at Durban specifically. So essentially, the African Water Cities Project is basically the intersection points of the issues of rapid urbanization and climate change, and trying to understand what are the kinds of things happening around there. Sometimes it's about water. It's really directly about the conditions of water, as you would see in the projects that we've worked on in Lagos. But sometimes it's really more about infrastructure. It's more about the social politics. But all of these things are driven by a condition of issues of urbanization, which is largely sort of a social dynamic, and climate change, which is largely an environmental dynamic. So in 2014, at Cornell, we began this research, and we formulated DECIMA, which again is sort of a tool to analyze this complex urban dynamics. And I will just take you very quickly through our first round of research on the continent, done by the students then. So for demographics, for instance, some of the interesting findings were that the issues of death rates, growth, and that of the 5 top diseases that contribute to death on the continent, malaria, which and waterborne diseases are top on the list. But malaria essentially is a disease that is also sort of connected to water, because that's what really is the source of is a breeding ground for mosquitoes. So it is actually in a way also sort of an environmental problem. This is research from the students, showing the diseases, some of the major causes of death, and that the prevalence of slum areas on the continent and even in Asia, of course, happens again around the periphery, around the edges on the continent. So the relationship between inequality is extremely tied to the geographical location. Economics, it's a very interesting picture. foreign direct investments and how China plays a very important role on the continent, and that the relationship between funding that goes into the continent and how some of that is, I mean, foreign direct investments and the trade. I mean, there are lots of important findings here, which basically questions issues of ownership, value, labor, and who's benefiting from this kind of trade transactions. Social politics, history, and culture being very important. I'll just run through this very quickly. And the fact that the political cycles really influence the type of the phases of development. So sometimes you'd be the time for development on a continent is extremely connected to the phase of political turn. So in the next 2 years, for instance, most of the African countries are going to go through the elections, and that means that there will be a lot of capital expenditure on projects because they're trying to get votes. And it's an interesting thing to understand that cycle and know that if you're probably going to be doing anything exciting or any large-scale projects, these are the next couple of years are the times to do it because there will be a lot more impetus. Infrastructure, the communications, the network of this is essentially cable connection and how the continent is being wired for internet use, and it's one of the largest markets for this. Of course, we've heard a lot about the frog leaping opportunities with the use of the cell phone, but continents continues to offer these kinds of connectivity. Water as a very important infrastructure, which really makes the continent a hub for many connections for transportation, ports, train tracks. So it's not a very connected continent, but the infrastructure, there are lots of gaps within the infrastructure that are yet to be filled. Morphology, for instance, the diverse geographic and topographic conditions begin to constrain. This really explains how topography constrains or shapes the potential for development of any kind of city. So this is a map of sort of the topography on the continent and the relationship of coastal cities along that. And essentially, again, going back to the fact that morphology is a very important driver for the growth of cities. And that's why humans have always settled around water bodies because, that's just a condition that is favorable to development. Environment, one of the interesting findings here is that, of course, there's the tropical belt. Africa has one of the largest sections of the tropical belt in all the continents on the world, and this tropical belt is the area where you have one of the largest biodiversities and a lot of resources. So these are places of opportunities, and that's why a lot of resources are mined along this tropical zone. But what we also discovered is that due to the forces of climate change, there is a shift happening. There's a sort of a southeast shift happening on the sort of a climate pattern. So there's going to be an increase in rainfall coming down here towards areas like Dar es Salaam, in Tanzania. So there's the climate pattern will be shifting on the continent much more than we have seen, and these areas are going to become drier. So that has a huge influence on the continents that will be doing well and where you'll be seeing droughts in the next few years. Finally, resources. Of course, oil has played a very important role in transactions on the continent, and water is an important resource, which is also a place now that we're seeing a lot more conflicts, more from water than even from oil. So finally, to sort of explain the African Water Cities project, it's again about rapid urbanization, where this is sort of unpacked on the issues of demographics, economic, social politics, and infrastructure, climate change, morphology, environment, and resources. And on the continents, it begins to elaborate how to understand all these challenges and perhaps opportunities that lie if you really have a much more multi-dimensional view of how things play out on the continent. The result of all of this research is a publication that we're trying to complete now from the Cornell research in 2014 and 2015. And there's a design, there are lots of design outputs also from the students. At the GSD this year, we are fortunate to be researching Durban with a team of 12 brilliant students that are working on a project in several projects in Durban. And one of the things that we're doing is, again, using Decima as a tool for understanding the complex dynamics of Durban in South Africa. And perhaps there's no better place to really understand issues of social politics, demographics than South Africa on the continent. It's really charged with a lot of these historical and economic issues. So we've been to Durban. It's quite there's our students there having a great time. So we've been working on this, and tomorrow is actually going to be our midterm review. We'll see how well. Where are these guys? Are you there? How are you guys doing? Okay, no pressure. All right, but the final output, of course, is research reports, design, and prototypes or solutions, design solutions. That's what we ultimately want to get to. And I will sort of explain how at Inlay, one project, we have used Decima to kind of understand a very complex universe of this is one project that has different scales of manifestation, from what we call the African Water Cities project that I've explained, to a regeneration plan of Makoko, to a prototype structure, to the Waterfront Atlas. And these projects are happening simultaneously, and they influence one another in different ways. So we began in 2011 with this urban research on Makoko in Lagos, in Nigeria, which is the largest country in Africa, with a population of over 170 million people. And it's expected to rival China's population by 2100. Of course, on the continent, these cities, these countries are also expected to have populations of over 200 million by 2100. Lagos, the commercial capital of Nigeria, is a city that is rapidly growing. The population is about 20 million people, and it's expected to be over 24 million people by 2020. It is a city that is by the Atlantic Ocean, where a large section of it is covered by water. Nearly 30% of its surface area is covered by water. It has a fissure that sort of ruptures its surface. So it's a relatively flat morphology, but with a large body of water cutting right through the heart of the city. And essentially, when you look at the way the city is growing, there's a proposal to sort of create a bridge that would connect these two parts of the city, which essentially would make the heart of the city just a body of water. And right in the center of that is somewhere at the edge is the emergence of a community that's called Makoko. Makoko is a community with nearly 100,000 people living with almost no, with mostly no land, no modern infrastructure, and with very, very, very scarce resources. They have grown from a very small community, and they've continued to expand towards the waterfront. And for me, Makoko is a representation of sort of maximum urbanization with minimum means. There's almost no infrastructure. You know, the only way you sort of get around is by boat. So this is a typical house in Makoko, a home in Makoko, and this is how people live. It's a very basic dwelling. This is the sort of the fundamental building block in Makoko. And when you look at this from a very, conventional sense, you just imagine that, again, this is in a typical sense, a slum area, a slum, and this guy has almost nothing. But upon closer inspection, you realize that he probably has all that he needs. This is the owner of the house here, and he's got 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 kids, maybe 6. I don't know. I mean, more kids than most people would ever have here. He's got a place where he showers. He has a kitchen set up here. He's got 2 vehicles that he goes around with. So he may seem to have nothing, but he seems to have everything that he needs in some way. So for me, it's a place where if you're trying to understand the fundamental way people live, not to say this is a condition that we should be happy about, but at least it's a place that you can learn from. This is your 7-Eleven in Makoko. That's how everyone goes shopping, and they have a life completely self-sustaining there. So to sort of analyze Makoko using Decima, it's a very simple. It's quite straightforward. From a demographics point of view, it's got Ilaje, Egun, and Igbo. There are lots of ethnicities around it, with nearly 100,000 people living. So, again, it's in a sense a city. The technical definition of a city in terms of demographics is a number. If there's a population of about 100,000 people, it is almost a city in itself. The economy, they've got boat building, fish processing, timber processing, and it's a potential. When you look at the the per capita population, GDP per capita population of the of people in Makoko, it is a potential 60 billion naira economy. I'm not sure what that means in dollars exactly, but it's a lot of money. From a social political angle, it's got the different cultures, the different religions. They were threatened. A very important part of this story is that the community was threatened for demolition because the government wanted at some point to reclaim the land, and they sort of displaced nearly 2,000 people. They sort of destroyed all their homes there. For us, it's a potential catalyst for a new culture of living on water. It's a potential for tourism and actually defining a new policy for building and urbanism on water. Infrastructure, it's got lots of waterways, jetties, water supply and power in ways that you don't usually use on land. And for us, again, it's a potential test bed for innovation and technology, where you can begin to sort of frog leap the conventional systems that exist. Morphology, because of course it's a community that is on water. What seems to be very disorganized in terms of its settlement is actually, upon close inspection, a rather fine grid where all the houses are somewhat oriented in the perfect direction to allow for the best sort of solar protection. So you have the east-west direction, and generally the homes are oriented through years of trial and error in the most perfect way. So morphologically and the way it's planned, it's actually quite intelligent. The soil structure is poor, so you really cannot build very far and deep in there. So you can only build one or two structures there because the topography, the soil condition is very weak. Poor drainage issues. But generally, it's because it's built largely on water, we see water as an asset. The environment allows us to begin to think of this as a potential place to develop solutions for adapting to issues of climate change, and a place that has a lot of resources. Primarily, they are settled there because they have fish. They fish and they provide timber. Nearly a third of Lagos's fish and timber supply are processed through Makoko. So in 2012, 2011, I was researching affordable housing, and that was when I actually visited Makoko to understand what a basic dwelling meant. And I was both shocked by the conditions that I saw there, at the same time very inspired by it. And I said, I would love to understand and learn how they built, and if I could, if we could work together to sort of improve the conditions of building and living there, then it would possibly be beneficial to solve the more complex issues of legitimacy and tenureship that they had. So we worked with the community through research and development to develop a prototype, which was a pilot project to create sort of an innovative approach to address their social and physical needs, and to also address the issue of climate change, because because they are fixed on stilts, they began getting flooded because the tidal conditions were changing due to increase in rainfall in Lagos. And of course, because Lagos is rapidly urbanizing, and land areas are becoming very, very scarce and expensive. It occurred to us that perhaps occupying some of the waterfronts with a new form of architecture and urbanism was actually an opportunity in a place where nearly 30% of the surface area is covered by water. So fundamentally, Makoko Floating School is a prototype, it's a catalyst, it's an innovation for adaptation to the issues of climate change, and it's a form of education, not particularly just as a school, which it was really just a formal thing, but really a place to educate us and to educate the rest of the world or the city about the issues of the opportunities of living in a totally different way than we're used to. It was supported by the United Nations Development Program and the Federal Ministry of the Environment, and that was how we actually got funding. I was going to do it personally, but when we developed the project, we now approached the UNDP, and it happened that they had a program that just suited it, and they said, well, this is perfect. This is, that we spend millions of dollars on projects that really don't get materialized on policies, and this is a great example of something that would fit in the Africa Adaptation Program. So that was the purpose of the building fundamentally. So we had a lot of research. I'm partly based in the Netherlands, where, of course, the knowledge and expertise of floating, of water is highly developed there. But more importantly was that I spent nearly a year and a half researching and working with the local community, with experts like that who had built some of those thousands of homes there, understanding how they built, the types of material that they used, the resources that they had, understanding their sort of complex economic needs, their social conditions, and really understanding the entire sort of dynamics of the community. A lot of documentation. We were supported by Henrik Boll Foundation with a small grant where we published 172-page documents, fully sort of analyzing the community needs, and worked with the community to develop a solution which is a hybrid of local intelligence, of just flotation, using sort of used and found materials in the community, local wood and bamboo, which they produce, to create a platform that we sort of scaled into this structure, which is a triangle. And a triangle is, we use a triangle as a form because it is the most stable form for flotation and balance. It has a relatively low center of gravity and stability. And we built what happens to be the tallest building and the largest public space in the community, using the same material that they built with this, everything around it was from no more than 50-meter radius. We built it with the community, with the carpenters, local carpenters there, with like 8 men in about 3-4 weeks of working. And as you can see here, with the first platform, the kids had already jumped on it and they were having a great time. And when the main structure was built, they had the first Christmas party in 2012. Even as just very basic infrastructure, it was already in use. The school, so it was used as an extension to an existing school, but also mostly functioned as a public space. It's a, so essentially, where it's a floating structure. we're not saying that we've invented something completely different. Like I mentioned, everyone has actually, floating homes, floating buildings have existed for many years, but to build something 3 floors with 100, 200 square meter, 10 meter tall, taller than anything in the community, with local materials, local resources, and 8 carpenters with nothing, with tools no sophisticated than a hand drill, is quite remarkable. And so this is just a way of working by understanding all the complex issues and and the needs there. These are just images. And we built it really quickly at a time when the government began demolishing the community, to demonstrate to the government that, look, you could also begin to think about how to develop this place using ways that they are used to, but improving those qualities. And it was literally what you would call, in the development terms, a minimum viable product. It was far from perfect, but somehow it began organizing everything around it to be a little more perfect, making the community gain legitimacy, bringing attention to it in a way that allowed the governments to actually pay attention. And they were quite surprised that we had built it. And this is the building sort of in scale to the rest of the community. And in fact, in 2013, the government had one of the officials in the state said it was an illegal structure and it was going to be demolished. So we became, also almost persona non grata, just because we had intervened with this project, and they were quite surprised by it. But we said, this is really just a prototype. If you can test it, you can try it out, and they in fact did that. They sent people there, and they said, well, you didn't get building permission, building permits, but technically, it's not quite a building, because it's not fixed, and it's not quite a boat. So we said, you don't get a building permission for a boat. And we actually got a mooring license from the Ministry of National Inland Waterways Authority. So we had done a lot of research and understood that it really fell within a sort of a policy gap of land water issues, of a typology that had never been, that is not sort of in the books. It's not, there's no policy that would to support this, and it's only recently that they began sort of accepting this project. So it was in use from 2012 to 2016 for various things, lots of, incredibly, used. It was handed over. We handed it over in 2015. It was used as a school. It was used, community. In fact, it became a very popular spot where movies were shot at the location. Of course, it had a huge impact socially and culturally. It had a lot of attention, which helped give the community a lot more stability. We think it's influenced quite a lot of other projects around the world. A lot of, I think, as an educational tool or a source of inspiration. And in 2015, finally, the Lagos State government endorsed the project, and in fact agreed that they would redevelop the community as a waterfront community. And unfortunately, after we had handed it over, the um, the people, or the people who were in charge of it, did not maintain it properly, and and that's not. I mean, I think to a certain extent, it's not something that you can blame anyone for, because generally this is a project that is new for everyone, whether it's a community and for ourselves. It's all sort of an experimental project, and one of the anchors broke and it got damaged and it was not maintained quickly. And we decided to sort of shore it up, and we stopped using it because we knew we were building the second iteration in Venice, right at the end of May last year, and we were planning to sort of replace that one, and there was and then it collapsed, and there was a huge uproar, sort of media uproar about its viability, etc., and that it was knocked down by the storm, and that all kinds of things. But the facts are that we know for sure that the building has withstood a lot more wind forces over the last 3 years. We have all the data, and it didn't sink, it didn't get blown by the storm. It really just deteriorated and came down, literally just as we were planning to demolish it and rebuild it. And that's not unusual in the sort of that environment, and it's a culture that we're also trying to change. So it's also sort of a behavioral pattern that we need to change, where they're very comfortable with conditions like this, where there's things are damaged and they keep sort of living in that kind of environment. So there needs to be also part of this is an education, where the collapse of the structure in fact began helping the community understand that they needed to take more responsibility to manage public spaces. So lessons were already being learned from even that problem. And we see it as not as a setback, but really as a moment to continue to be relentless. And any sort of innovation that has been successful has also has gone through a lot of failures. So we accept that, we see the problems, and we've learned from it, and we're sort of moving forward. And moving forward is this opportunity that we had last year at the Venice Biennale, where we built the second iteration of the project, which we called MFS2. And this is a collage of the school in Venice. What's interesting is that the first settlers of Venice are called Incola Lacune, which literally means the lagoon dwellers. So in a way, the first settlers of Venice were no different from the people of Makoko. They were fishermen and traders. So MFS2 in Venice got built in 10 days in a very different fashion. And the goal of the MFS2 was to improve the technology, to improve this somewhat as a product that is prefabricated. So essentially, what we're trying to produce is a prefabricated floating structure. It's not particularly about program, it's really about this element, this product that is highly developed, that you can assemble it with very, very simple means, and all the elements are somewhat modular, and you can assemble and disassemble it and move it around. Now in Venice, it was built on land, and this is the irony of local context and the kind of dynamics that shape the way you actually get things built. While we built it on water in Makoko, in Venice, it was easier to sort of build it on land, and it was sort of we improved all the joints, connections, increased, used some steel elements, made all the connections bolted, improved the anchoring conditions, took all the things that we learned from MFS1 in Makoko and improved it on this one, and created a structure that was scalable and replicable, and you could easily manufacture it. And the idea was to be able to produce it in very limited time. What's going on here? Oh, yeah. So essentially, it's sort of a product that you can literally just buy off the shelf is what we're kind of working towards. At least you can order it and you can then assemble it with very limited skills. And someone reminded me yesterday that this image was actually quite like Bucky's transportation, and I thought it was quite funny. But these kind of circumstances that allow, so in Venice, in Makoko, we built this with very, very simple means. In Venice, the conditions of building are so peculiar that it was actually easier to build it, or it was the logical way to do it was to build it on land and put it on a barge, and through this sort of heroic move, like ship it across the Venice, through the San Marco Square. And again, someone reminded, us that, this is somewhat like Aldo Rossi and history sort of repeating itself. And for some reason, you then realize that, these things you do when you don't intend to do them, because that's not, I was literally trying to build it the way I built it in Makoko. And, I said, no, you have to build it by hand, you have to build it on location. But at the last minute, everything, it just happened that this was the only way to actually build this one in Venice. So this, 4 men, cranes, machines, wall panels we developed through just using very marine boards and printed, screen printing, lifted into place. And so it was used as an exhibition space for an exhibition called the Waterfront Atlas. Let's run the credits there. Thank you to our sponsors. And it was used as an exhibition space for the sort of last part of this discussion of this sort of universe of projects that are interrelated, called the Waterfront Atlas. And I would say this is the largest scale of the highest scale of the largest scale of the project, which is really a platform, a knowledge platform, where we're beginning to identify not only the major cities all around the world, but projects and communities, and beginning to gather them. So we created maps where we invited people to pin locations of projects, communities that they could identify. So we had all this. We had all the 7 continents there, and you could pin on the wall different new projects. So it was sort of an open source platform done manually, where we had people writing new things and collecting information. So we want to digitize this as a resource for knowledge about waterfront cities and communities and development. And so these are some of the examples of the posts, the post-its, interesting projects from different parts of the world, from the US, from Mexico, and some had no ideas, but really important points to free Palestine. So we also collaborated with the World Building Institute by Alex McDowell, where they did a project called Dry Cities, and we had video feeds. And we were fortunate to have been awarded with the Silver Lion for that exhibition. And as we speak now, MFS2 is being disassembled in Venice, and the materials are going to be shipped or are going to be driven to Amsterdam to storage facility, and we will be thinking about what to do with it next. So what's next? While we have MFS2 in storage as our sort of classic model, we're already working on the next third iteration, MFS3, which would be launched in Belgium. We've been asked to produce the next one, but also now thinking about how to scale up this project into not just one, but a condition that would allow us to multiply this. The Lagos State government has also asked us to give them a proposal, or a ministry, parastatal of the state government has also asked us to give them a proposal for replacing the one in Makoko. And the idea is that you can adapt it for different uses, but the general things that not only we're not saying that this is the only prototype, but there are other ways of building, lots of ideas of building locally, and also thinking of global solutions of the things that are relevant. To sort of create a condition that we imagine that what if we begin to use the decimal to sort of again understand very complex dynamics of things, and understand the opportunities and the learning points that we have seen in cities like Chicago, water cities like Chicago, Amsterdam, Venice, and Makoko, and begin to bring these together into an innovation bed where, at the periphery you have conditions that are local to the African continent, where you have, the African version of sustainable buildings with higher density, and as you move towards the periphery, you have conditions that are more similar to maybe Amsterdam or Venice, and as you move away, you begin to sort of get a lot more fragmented conditions and use typologies of building, different typologies, not just a floating structure, but create recreational areas, create infrastructure areas. You might have a little swimming pool there if you want. You have some workspaces, you have agricultural spaces, and hopefully produce a vision of a new African water city that addresses the challenges and harnesses the opportunities of climate change and urbanization in our time. Thank you very much.
So Kunle will accept some questions and comments. Maybe if I could just begin. There was a moment early on when you showed the MFS1. I was thinking about the domino diagram of Le Corbusier and how powerful and yet simple it was, and especially its scalability, that you can actually, the first time I went to Chandigarh, the town, I didn't know this before, that most of the commercial structures and business structures are actually domino houses scaled up. And then when you showed, the entire cities made of MFS, I thought about that. But the big difference, the amount, at first I was wondering how you were going to bring all that research that you do into the design. And I realized for me, the moment everything clicked was this idea of the local intelligence in a full, robust way was coming into the design, and that you had to immerse yourself in what you call the decimary, the economy, the culture, the climate. You have to immerse yourself so that local intelligence comes into your project. And then it became very, very beautiful for me in terms of that our students often worry about issues of identity. How do you preserve the identity of a place, a social identity? And I actually started to believe that it was really, it seems very, MFS1 seemed very proud, notwithstanding the maintenance issues, it seemed proud to be there and to be a kind of monument for where it was. And I wanted to ask you, because you've thought so much about these, and then you're going to MFS 2 and 3, so far maintaining, in a way, what I would call the local intelligence, with refinements and with some prefabrication and things like that. But compared to, for example, I know that China has made a lot of, more for refugees, maybe more for refugees, but also for kind of emergency urbanisms. China has made some things out of more modern materials, very inexpensive, very easy, very lightweight, very easy to build. Norway, I think in Rwanda, maybe the mud bricks and metal roofs, which look very different from anything that was there before. I think it was Norway did these things, and with all good intention, but they seemed, and maybe, and I always thought, am I just being stupid that things can't be different? I mean, of course things can be different, but they weren't as compelling as yours, which uses this local intelligence. Do you have some thoughts about the difference between that and using, more prefabrication, more modern materials, non-local labor, but training people in non-indigenous labor, non-local labor? How do you feel about those different ways of approaching?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think the Decima as a tool is particularly developed for understanding the issues. I mean, at least for this project on the African continent, and they sort of stemmed out of the needs that we identified quite early. And I think some of the things that you're discussing fall under resources, and whether it's human capital as a resource or material resource. And I think the main challenge on the continents, in different parts of the continent, is how material is processed and how it is, so extracted. It's mostly is extracted by the rest of the world, and it's taken out and it's processed and is brought back in. So one of the goals of working in this sort of an environment is, how do you process materials locally? How do you use the resources that we have, whether it is wood, whether it is earth, whether, green, whatever it is, you're creating local resources, processing them locally. And it's one of the things that my studio at the GST is investigating. So we're not, of course you could import materials and you could train people to do things,
right.
But that is the challenge on the continent, that materials are being imported, and you're losing value by taking out raw material, taking it back out, and then bringing it back in. So I think architecture has a role to play in terms of creating solutions that can be that are able to, as part of their processes, keep the value within the continent. And we don't have all the answers, but some of these really just mean that you should develop just material technologies locally. And Nigeria, for instance, is at this. In fact, this morning I got a call from a very important developer who builds tons of malls, and he's like, well, the economy has changed, and the entire value chain of the continent of the country that is in recession at the moment is looking towards. It's about looking inwards. So they're cutting down importation. They're asking people to find solutions of how to build locally, how to use local materials. So I think it is a direction that we have to pursue in architecture, and if you do that, then the results will inevitably have an identity that is of that environment.
Are there more questions or comments?
I think just one short question. You mentioned that.
Stella, just wait 1 second till we get. Oh, yeah, just yeah.
You mentioned that you are you could produce these prototypes to sell them, right? The one in Venice. I just wonder how much it costs.
It's a very good question. Well, it's a very difficult question because it really depends on where you're producing it and the labor. So I think what is fundamental, what we're really focusing on is a system that allows. So essentially, it's almost like a file and a manual and a maintenance structure that you can distribute, and with a CNC or a cut sheet, you can get it. You can send it to Lagos, send it to to Cambodia, and they will cut you based on their local materials, and they have instructions on how to sort of assemble it, and it is designed for a specific location, for specific code requirements. So we're developing it for EU codes, and I think and also the US code. I'm not quite sure which if the MFS3 is particularly for EU codes. Yeah. So it's the cost is really, it really depends on location, and it's very difficult to tell you exactly what it is. But it should cost nothing if it's just a file. Oh, for Venice, let's not go there. No. Venice Biennale, particularly, the conditions of Venice and costs of doing anything in that period, as you probably know very well, quite expensive. Yes.
Hi, I actually have a question. I was thinking about when you were talking about how you built the prototype of MSF2 in Venice and how you couldn't build it in the way that you would have built it if you had built it in Lagos. And I'm referencing a paper that was written in 2001, Tropicalization by Jeffrey Sachs, and he talks about how the desire to build in this way that is North American or European and imposing that model on a lot of tropical countries is maybe causing a proliferation of perhaps poverty in more tropical parts of the world. And I noticed a lot of your precedents that you talked about, for example, Amsterdam or Chicago or even Venice. These are all temperate climates, or more temperate than, say, Lagos. And I was wondering how you reconcile that difference, considering that a lot of architectural discourse does come from so-called European or North American traditions and how you apply that into a local climatic kind of sensitivity in your work.
Oh, thanks. I think, you know, most of the presentation was about local climatic issues, and but at the same time, I think what I was saying is that you have to also recognize the best practices globally, and while everything that I have explained today stemmed from Makoko, which is a technically one of the most difficult or one of the poorest communities in Lagos, in a tropical climate, producing architecture at its very fundamental basic need level, where there's no air conditioning. The source and DNA of the architecture is from Makoko, and it has become, in a way, an export product. So I'm not even sure I know any sort of African building that you would say is now an export product to the rest of the world. So all where the references I was making with Chicago, with Venice, with Amsterdam is just to say, while you're thinking locally, while your values are primarily local, you should also recognize the relevant global values, global inputs that would make it better. So there are things that we need to learn, and I think it's about cross-pollination. So the example is about bridging or bringing together the lessons learned from cities all over the world, and it could be Cambodia, it could be it could be Thailand, it could be anywhere. But you have to have a broad idea and localize your solution based on your needs. Yes.
Thank you, Kunle, for a great talk. I just quickly and kind of out of my own curiosity, the project, the MFS, as you just said, kind of very much originated out of Makoko's source and or the city provided the kind of source and DNA for the project. That is kind of contrary, I would say, to a developer mentality, which is looking for a replicable model in its most extreme, to go not only to other cities, but other countries around the world. Is there, I don't know, so to replicate this almost would mean that you would need to kind of embed yourself in a very similar way in another local environment to kind of produce another project from the ground up, from a community's DNA. So do you have any ideas for where you might do that, or have things kind of come across your desk that you've considered?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. I think that's probably one of the most important lessons that we have gotten from Makoko Floating School as a project. That we, through the project, we are beginning to understand a way of working, a sort of an ideology, not necessarily one. It's not about the form of the building, but it's about how, and that's what the Decima is really about. It allows us to have a tool to analyze any context very quickly. It's not perfect, but it's just one of the things that we're using to understand if we're working in, for instance, in whether it's London or whether it's New York, we will have to embed ourselves locally and understand that context very quickly. So even the most kind of extreme end of the project of working in terms of clients, we worked on Serpentine Gallery. For us, the solution or the design was a result of looking at one particular, I don't know if you're familiar with the project. It's essentially a reverse replica of Queen Caroline's temple. And it's essentially a building that learned from a 17th century historic building. And we used the same material. We understood the form. We kind of understood how it was built in the 17th century, and created something completely new using the same material, but turning it around to create something modern. So it's about the idea of how you read a context and apply yourself to produce something different remains the same in any location that we operate.
Last question.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. I wonder, I think that it's very interesting, the process of not only design, but how the experience influenced the policy itself. So it's like how it acquired like a broader impact at the city and perhaps at the national level. So I wonder which was like the inflection point when the policymakers or the politicians stop like blaming the project and the process, and they had to recognize it as a legitimate practice. They had to also recognize the people that were involved in the practice and in the neighborhood, and how that was the process of impact and transformation of the mentality.
It's a very good question. I mean, it's a very painful process, to say the least. But, it's one that really requires tenacity and persistence, and just, you have to, the governments, or most governments are set up to do things the way to do things as an establishment, right? So change is not a very easy thing for most governments. And if you introduce something that creates, that forces them to think differently, you're going to encounter a lot of resistance. And so it means that you have the burden of proof. You have the burden of chasing up. You have you have to constantly be on top of the matter. So this is something that's we spent about 3 years writing. I wrote more than 50 letters. Had different meetings with them. It has gone through 2 different governments, and things change, and you just have to keep at it. But I think the most important step we took was that we, first of all, we had some informed basis for our action, but more importantly was that we actually took a step. We built it, regardless of any kind of condition. So we simply just said, this is our proposal. It's not a paper proposal, it's a physical prototype. You go there. If you like it, tell us. If you don't, let us know. And they actually did. In fairness, they sent nearly 50 representatives to assess the building over the course of a year. And they wrote recommendations that, okay, you should change this, you should make this improvements, you should increase the handrails, you should do this. And finally, they had an assessment, and they were very amazed that, oh, it's quite stable. So I think that's the most important thing, that you actually act and you take action. And I think that's perhaps the most impactful way of changing the sort of the status quo, let's say.
Julie, I think so many of the project, the research, the way you work touches to me on so many of the things that the school that our school is interested in, the way you address the issues, the social issues, resources, climate, context, but it's always with a kind of techne of the architect, of the designer, working within what is it that architecture and design can do, rather than just wring our hands, which we often do. So I just think it's really important that you're here at the school, and I appreciate so much. I hope you can come back and kind of keep expanding this kind of work with us too. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.